I want to speak for a few moments on the theme, Jesus, a widow, and temple economics. This passage is very familiar to many of us, especially during a church pledge campaign. Now, this sermon is not part of the pledge campaign, but I want us to take a new look at this story that has been passed down through our history of interpretation as the widow's mite. That phrase appears nowhere in the text, but that's the label that we have given this story as a way of confining it to a certain understanding. And that understanding is that this presumably poor widow, yes, and it is very common throughout the biblical tradition for the prophets, particularly, to proclaim to the people that God will protect. God is concerned. God is paying attention to the widows, the orphans, and the strangers. So why this group of people, widows, orphans, and strangers? Because widows and orphans and strangers were the most marginalized people in the society. Orphans because they had no parents to protect them. And in a patriarchal society, women, widows particularly, because they had no man to protect them. And it required a relationship with a male to have any status in a patriarchal society. Women could not directly own property. Women could not be witnesses or bring suit in court. And many of you this morning, I won't call any names, but you who are old enough to remember will remember, in this country, in your lifetime, women couldn't have credit in their own name. It sounds insane right now, but it wasn't that long ago in this country. Women could not vote, could not have credit or property in their name. And when we listen to the plight of women, much more severe than American women throughout the world, we shouldn't hold our noses up so high, because it wasn't that long ago that women in our country suffered the same marginalization and dispossession of their rights. And so a woman without a relationship to a man in a patriarchal society, either a husband or a male son, was vulnerable to pillage, to theft, to others stealing their property and abusing them in a variety of ways, and they had no recourse without a male in their lives, either a husband or a son. So that's why widows are God's special concern. And that's why widows were Jesus' special concern. And it's therefore even more interesting that we have taken this story, and yes, we make a hero out of this widow for giving her last half pennies. It took two of her the smallest coins for her to give 1 penny. And we applaud her for her sacrifice. But there's a new interpretation of this passage that is starting to take hold. Ched Myers, in his groundbreaking work, Binding the Strong Man, his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, says, we've got this thing backwards. Jesus is not praising the widow for giving everything to the temple. He is condemning the temple for making the widow give everything to the temple. Even her last penny. And what does it say? Everything she had to live on. Jesus is trying to get us to see the contrast. We always look at the widow and her mite, but we don't look at the rich and their might. He says, a rich man and a widow came. But we always wind up just looking at the widow when Jesus is really trying to get us to look at the rich man. So what if this history of interpretation actually turns out to be a ruse to get us to look at the widow and her mite and to ignore the rich man who walks away still rich while she walks away destitute? It kind of makes more sense for the Jesus that I've come to know, for that to actually be the point of his parable. And understand, while it's not in the form of a parable, it is yet a parable. We have to open our minds and to break out of this Sunday school world that we were all raised in, to read the Gospels as chronological history, to read the gospel as though these gospel writers were following Jesus around and writing down whatever he saw and did. And Jesus happened to be in the temple one day and he saw a rich man giving out of his abundance, and he saw a widow giving her 2 little mites, and he praised. No, that's not how the gospels came together. These gospel writers, they were in modern parlance, they were op-ed writers. They were shaping and forming a story to help people understand what Jesus was trying to accomplish in the world. They were not journalists in that strict, objective, this is what happened kind of sense. They were telling you a story to help you understand something else. So the very inclusion of this story was an editorial decision. This isn't just what happened and they wrote it down. They decided, or Jesus decided, in his preaching and teaching, yeah, certainly there were rich people giving in the temple. Certainly there were widows giving in the temple, but Jesus crafted a story about them that he told to help us understand something about him, widows, and temple economics. The temple, we have to understand, was not just a place of worship and liturgy. The temple is more like a central bank than a place of worship. That was where, yes, the temple tax was collected from every male adult Jew in the world. They would send the temple tax. And then all of the sacrificial offerings and all of the free will offerings. Now we have one simple plate in the narthex for you to give your contributions. When you went into the treasury that Jesus was talking about in this story, there were 13 receptacles for your offering. 13, and they each had a different purpose. And so the temple became a treasury. It was the central bank of Israel, and it functioned that way. And that's where vast sums of gold and silver, not to mention the artifacts within the temple and their great value, were kept. And so Jesus comes to the temple not for worship, but for a lesson on economics. And he says, look at that rich man. He gives out of his abundance, meaning that he hardly feels it. That he gives and it doesn't change his course of life at all. But the poor, poor widow, and she is a stand-in for all poor. What she gives is a total sacrifice and is left with nothing to live on. Right now in our country, we are debating the tax structure in our nation today. That's the responsibility of our government. Every administration tries to adjust and to rejigger the tax system, allegedly to improve the economics of our nation, but too often to improve the economics of the wealthiest. Now, I don't want you to think that I've put down theology and taken up economics. No, I did study theology. I did not study economics. But I just want to share something from someone who not just studied economics, but lives economics. And I'll quote before I tell you who it's from. In a week when taxes and tax returns have dominated the headlines, billionaires are especially concerned as to its impact upon them and have joined the debate. One billionaire said, "I have never had it so good. What has happened in recent years is this: we were told a rising tide would lift all boats, but the rising tide has lifted all yachts." Warren Buffett said that. And he also compared himself not to a poor widow, but to his secretary. Next slide, please. Buffett's secretary, I'm sorry, go ahead to the next one. Buffett's secretary since 1993, Debbie Bosanak, pays a tax rate of 35.8% of her income, while Buffett pays a rate of 17.4%. She's not a widow, I don't know, but she is a stand-in for the average working person. And he is clearly a stand-in for the super, super duper rich. He goes on. The question is, what is fair when you have to raise multi-trillions of dollars to fund the United States of America, said Buffett. He said this, and this is one of the big arguments against raising taxes. He says raising taxes, then people won't work and they won't earn more money because they're just gonna have to fork it over to the government. Warren Buffett said, raising taxes will not change my behavior. I have paid all kinds of rates, and I've always been interested in making money. I believe this should be a defining issue. Debbie, his secretary, he says, works just as hard as I do, and she pays twice the rate that I do. Buffett had one question for Mitt Romney. Now, this was years ago, but Mitt Romney is still representing the billionaire class. He's against the current tax rate being offered or being suggested for the billionaires. Buffett had this question: do you think the tax system should be perpetuated? But he challenges Congress to make the change. He lashed out at assertions from many leaders that the Buffett rule is class warfare. You've heard that one. Anytime you talk about tax the rich, oh, that's class warfare. Warren Buffett had this to say: if this is a war, my side has the nuclear bomb. We have K Street, we have Wall Street, Debbie doesn't have anybody. I want a government that is responsive to the people who got the short straw in life. The widow, the poor. Theologian ACDS has talked about what she calls Muharista Theology, the theology of grandmothers. Very often grandmothers are widows. And we do know that women tend to outlive men. And that's why there is this class of widows, of older women who aren't connected to men in that classic definition. And I was concerned about why women were outliving men so much. So what's going on here? And it's actually much more simple than I thought. Men drink alcohol more. Men smoke more. Men take more risks in various kinds of activities. Men engage in more violent behavior and the use of guns. And all of these things impact men's life expectancy. So the answer is you don't need to become female. You just need to stop drinking, smoking, shooting, and dying. But until that happens, women will continue to outlive men. So ACDS says, the way that God cares and consequently calls God's people to care about the downtrodden, and particularly the widow, is foundational to how modern day Christians are to understand and live out Abuelita Theology, a theology centered on the grandmothers, the widows in our midst. Following section will explain what Abuelita Theology is and how it finds its roots in Muharista Theology. Muharista Theology. First, Muharista Theology is a reflective action that has its goal in liberation. It was coined by Cuban native Ada Maria Acevedo, a professor formerly at Union Theological Seminary. After serving as a missionary in Peru for 3 years, during her time there, Acevedo realized that not only is liberation necessary for justice and peace, but that one cannot be liberated at the expense of another or isolated from others. I can't be free without you being free, and you can't be free without me being free, in other words. Thus, Muharista theology should not be understood as a theology exclusively for Latinas, but a theology from the perspective of Latinas. It is a process of empowerment for marginalized women that begins with the development of a strong sense of moral agency. It then works on clarifying the importance and value of these women, of who these women are, what they think, and what they do. This process enables them to understand oppressive structures that determine their daily lives, and to understand that the goal of their struggle should not be to participate in and to benefit from these structures, but to work toward changing them radically. The goals of Muharista theology are to provide a platform for the voices of Latina grassroots women, to develop a theological method that takes seriously the religious understandings and practices of Latinas as a source for theology, and to challenge the theological understandings, church teachings, and religious practices that oppress Latina and all women. Teachings like the widow's mite. I added that last part. It does not insist that liberation is something one person gives another, but instead it is a process in which the oppressed become protagonists or protagonistas of their own stories. As Moltmann argues, the dignity of humans consists in humans being humans. This involves their existence, humanity, and essence becoming actualized and thus coming into their own truth. In other words, everyone should have a voice. Everyone should have a vote. And when everyone has a voice and a vote, it's not me giving you liberation or you giving me liberation. It is for all of us working together for the liberation of all of us, but it takes everyone's participation. So the question for us today is this: what would Jesus say about our tax system 2,000 years later that continues to tax widows more heavily than billionaires? 2,000 years we've had to listen to this story about the widow and the rich man. And that's what we should call it, not the widow's mite, but the story of the widow and the rich man. Because he's trying to get us to see this system and the temple economics that exploit this poor woman and require of her her last 2 half pennies in order to be in compliance with the temple, its theology, and its economics. Jesus, I think, would be disappointed that after all this time, we're still calling it the story of the widow's mite and praising her faithfulness rather than looking at the rich man and condemning his greed. To be faithful to the vision of the way of Jesus, we should all strive to create a society that continues to center the concerns of the marginalized and uplift the voices and values of the downtrodden, the walked on, the overlooked, the least of these, because they are God's favorite people. Inasmuch as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. So when we vote and when we advocate, we have to look not just at the widow, but to look at the temple, the rich, and all of it together and ask that central question: how can everyone retain and live and fulfill the human dignity bequeathed to them by none other than the Creator of us all? And if that becomes our vision of life, then there will be no more poor widows, but everyone will be able to live as God has called us to live. As the people of God say, amen.